class in seminary, wasn't thrilled about it, and the teacher, Professor Wilkerson, she was phenomenal. Loved this teacher. I don't know what I got in class, I couldn't remember to tell, but I loved the class, and she made such an impact on me. She was always with a smile, always had words of wisdom, and so years later I was able to co-pastor or pastor a church, and her son happened to be one of the pastors in our area, so I got to know him. And I came across a message that Brian gave years ago, and a very different flavor of Easter. And so he was a stimulus for what I have to you for today. Family's important, and he reflected a lot of what his mom taught us. So, I had an old friend die last week, cancer. Took her at an early age. She had a little boy. She had no husband. She was broke. Hers was a tragic story. She had dreams. She had hopes for the future. And a mom at the time who had resources to help her. But she made some bad choices, followed by some more bad choices. And unfortunately, her dreams remained dreams. I had another friend. He had big dreams, and he was heading toward them. He was making good choices, loved God, loved people, pretty much made an impact wherever he went, doing everything right. And then he had an accident. And next thing we know, Matt's a quadriplegic, and he can't move from the neck down. He spent the next 30 years of his life in a chair. He couldn't hold his daughters for them. He couldn't hug his wife. I can remember even talking to him about what was it like, and he goes, Dave, I couldn't even if I wanted to take my life because I can't move. Yet, he impacted more people in that chair than I think he ever would have. Not in that chair. A couple of years ago, Matt went home to be with Jesus. But suddenly, his world became a chair and a bed, and he couldn't move any part of his body except his head. Life has a way of killing dreams. Doesn't it? You set out with high hopes for your schooling, for your career, your family, the golden years, and then your plans, your aspirations, your expectations, they just don't turn out the way you expected. Plans fall through, people let you down, you let yourself down, sickness hits, mostly when you're unexpecting it. And suddenly your life, the one you're living, isn't the life you dreamed of at all. And you find yourself in a place that you never expected that you would be. Been there? We all have dreams that haven't come true. We all find ourselves in places we never expected to be. We know how it feels to be so disappointed, so discouraged, and it feels at those moments as though hope is gone. And at best, something you presently can't reach and touch. And you sit and you wonder, and you bathe in that discouragement and that disappointment and that lost hope. If it's not true for you right now, it probably is true for someone you know. Well, happy Easter to you, Dave. We play this exciting video, and then you get an Easter sermon like this. Easter's supposed to be about this bright new day, new Easter clothes, dressed up, sun shining, life's good kind of feeling, words like compassion and forgiveness and love and hope and salvation, phrases like he arose and the grave is empty. even if it's been bad for you so far this year, Easter is supposed to be the time to brighten your day. And Easter is supposed to remind us that we have a new lease on life, right? And it does. Easter is supposed to remind us of the new lease that we have on life, and it does, but we can so often forget that. And that's because that's not where Easter began. That's not where Easter begins. It begins at a grave with a woman weeping. And a lot of people sad, struggling with the hope lost. So let's begin the journey this morning in a dark place and see if it can lead us to a brighter place, a place of hope, a place filled with some compassion. We're going to look at John chapter 20, verses 10 to 18 specifically, and it's stimulated for me from Mark 8, which I've been working through the Gospel of Mark in these past months. And it's a passage that we talked about for the last couple of weeks. Jesus looks out at thousands of people that have been with him for 3 days, and they're really, really hungry. And he says, for the first time, we see often that Jesus has compassion. That's what the gospel writers said about him. But in this particular instance, Jesus looks out at the people and he says, I have compassion on them. And then he sat down and he proceeded to feed over 4,000 people. Some people say it was probably up to 10,000. We're not sure, but we know it was thousands. With a few loaves of bread and some fish. And by the way, for those of you that maybe don't know the story, this was the second feeding. The first one was the 5,000, just men. It was probably about 25,000 people. This is the feeding of the 4,000, which happens just months after. And the people ate and they were satisfied. That's what it says. And then they went home, but they weren't the same. They had changed. And they began to communicate it with everybody else all around. And what about this last week? Pentecost. When Pentecost came and the Holy Spirit kind of flowed down on these people, probably about 120 people meeting in a room after Jesus had died and was seen again and then rose and went to heaven and sent the Holy Spirit. It says that they went out and speaking all different languages. Everybody was hearing the gospel being proclaimed, the message of Jesus, things about God in their own tongue, and a revival broke out like none other. Now I wonder, they didn't have cell phones back then, but I wonder how many other Pentecosts took place all around the world at that particular moment when the Holy Spirit was sent to us. I wonder, and I think, there were bundles of people in all different areas that experienced the exact same thing. Anyway, Jesus' compassion fills him at that moment, and he said, I looked out at the people. He looked out at the people and he said, I had compassion on them. And that led him to this miraculous thing of feeding thousands. And it led him to heal people continuously. And it ultimately is what led him to go to the cross and die for all of us. His compassion and his love. He didn't have to. I don't know if we can comprehend the fact that God did not have to go to the cross to die for us, and he still would have remained just. He still would have remained faithful. He still would have been holy, because he would have allowed us to pay the penalties of our own sin, of not being perfect. And how can imperfect people get to a perfect place called heaven? But he looked at us and had compassion. And he said, someone has to pay. It will be me. And he became a man. And he lived and he died for us. And we have no comprehension. We said there's lots of people that have lived and died. There's lots of people that have lived and died for someone else. But we have no comprehension of the kind of pain that he suffered. Yes, he was crucified. Many people were crucified. But he died on that cross, and it says that he took the sins upon himself. All the guilt, all the shame, all the anger, all those emotions at one time were piled on him. God literally had to turn his back on himself because he couldn't look at so much sin, and he died. He died virtually alone, separated from his Father. We have no idea of the spiritual anguish that he suffered at that moment, at that point. And he didn't have to. He chose to. That was his compassion that he allowed to be nailed to the cross. Compassion, real compassion, will be more than words or a few feelings. It will lead to action, and it will change people and give hope where there isn't any. Life without hope. What would that be like? Gospel of John offers some details and some richness into the resurrection story that the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they tell us what happened, but John adds a new flavor, and particularly what happened to Mary. And it teaches us, I think, how to live in light of what happened that day at the cross that we call Easter. That morning, after Christ had died and was buried, and these people were sad. I'm beyond sad, because this was their hope, Jesus Christ. And he's suddenly gone. He's dead. Dead. I mean, they took him down. They checked his pulse. They put him in a grave. Mary was coming that morning because, well, back then, they didn't have chambers where you stick somebody, and he was in the ground. She wanted to put spices on the body. And so John 20, 1-13, she comes to the grave, her and two other women, and they're wondering how they're going to get somebody to roll a rock in front of the grave away so they can put spices on the body. This is what it says. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter. Now, in the other Gospels, we know it's Mary and two other women that come, and the stone was rolled away. And so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, that was John, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other outran Peter and reached the tomb first. John doesn't say his name, but he's letting us know that he was faster than Peter. And then Simon Peter came along behind him. There's just a little bit of a slam right there. John's giving Peter. And he went straight into the tomb, and he saw strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, John, also went inside, and he saw and believed. And they did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. And so two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "Well, they have taken my Lord away." She said, "And I don't know where they have put him." So we know through the other Gospels, and when we piece it all together, that she and two other women ran, found the stone rolled away at the entrance. They went inside, and they saw these angelic figures. Mark puts it this way in chapter 16. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting at the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go and tell his disciples." And so they ran and told the disciples, and Mary apparently followed them back to the tomb. I'm sure she was beginning to think, hey, I'll lead them back. I'm sure she was last. And so when she finally arrived at the tomb, because Peter and John had run on before him, the boys left as soon as Mary was coming. They were leaving, and Mary was alone at the tomb. and its emptiness was staring her in the face. Now you would think she'd be excited. She'd be thrilled, but we know the end of the story. She saw her hope gone. She did the only thing that she could do at that moment. She felt hopeless, and she cried. But Jesus was waiting for her. Now, who is Mary Magdalene or Mary Magdala? All kinds of legends have arisen around her. Tradition dating back to the 8th century defines her as a prostitute from Luke chapter 7, who anointed Jesus with her tears, but there is really nothing in the Bible that supports that idea. The rock opera, Jesus Christ Superstar, portrayed her as this sensual woman that was torn between a religious devotion and a romantic attraction with Jesus. I Don't Know How to Love Him was the song that she sang. According to a popular novel years ago, The Da Vinci Code, Mary became Jesus' wife, the mother of his child, the leader of the church after his death, but none of these portrayals are biblical or historical in support. What we're told is that Mary of Magdala was one of several women who became followers of Jesus Christ and helped and supported his ministry. We also know that Mary Magdala was a woman that was delivered from demonic possession. She had a bunch of demons living inside of her. I have no clue what that must have been like. We don't know what the position looks like in Mary's case, but we do know from other biblical accounts that the demons could cause a person to cut themselves, throw themselves into a fire, lose control of their behavior and their emotions. Besides being physically violent and superhumanly strong, as the demonic in the that Jesus healed, that was breaking chains. You know, it's interesting. Back then, they had no problem believing that someone was demon possessed. Today, we don't buy into that. Yeah, we're sophisticated. So we have come up with all kinds of terms that are used to describe that these days. Whatever her past had been, it was horrible. It was horrible. And Jesus came to her, and with a word, he delivered her from that. He didn't sit down, he didn't counsel her. With a word, she was healed. And she was free from those dark forces, those voices that constantly were in her head. And she suddenly found life again. And her life now centered around Jesus. But now, tragically, suddenly, it was gone. Why are you crying? These angelic figures asked her. I mean, to her, it must have sounded like the most ridiculous question. Why shouldn't I be crying? Jesus is gone. Someone took him. In verse 13, that's what she says. They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him. Her hope hung on him. And now she was hopeless. Notice how she speaks about him. Very close and personal, as someone she loved and loved her. Not, they have taken his body away, but they have taken my Lord away. Very personal. My teacher, my Savior, my Lord. It was very personal to her. After all this, this was the one who gave her her life back. After years of torment, she had begun to once again dream of what could be. Of good things for herself, of good things for the people that she cared about. But life at that moment had killed her dream yet again. A Roman cross had seen to that. So what now? Are these demons now going to come back? Are they going to haunt me again? What am I going to be? What am I going to do? What did my future have without Jesus? They've taken my hope away. And I don't know where they put it. And I'm hurting because I'm scared now of what's going to be in the future. What is hope? Hope. We say it, flows off our tongue so easy. What is hope anyway? Wishful thinking? Some optimism? I hope it doesn't rain. I hope the economy bounces back. I hope the sermon doesn't go too long. That's wishful thinking. So. The dictionary tells us that hope is, quote, a desire with the expectation of fulfillment. So hope begins with a desire for something good, but then adds an element of expectation, a confident expectation. Not, I hope my wallet is in my back pocket, but my wallet is in my back pocket. When we hope for something, we're counting on it. But hope is more than a word. Hope is to the spirit what oxygen is to the body. Without it, we die. When a team loses hope, I was an athlete, the game's over. They lost. When investors lose hope, the stock market crashes. When a patient loses hope, death is just crouching at the door. Viktor Frankl survived years in Nazi concentration camps, and he noticed that prisoners died sometimes very shortly after Christmas. They were hoping to be free by then. And when they weren't, he says, for some reason they gave up. They gave up hope. And he learned that as long as prisoners had something to live for, a reason to press on, they could endure pretty much anything. But once they lost their hope, Frankl said, they died quickly. Dostoevsky, he said that to live without hope is to cease to live. I have had many opportunities in my life, and I was a basketball player early on, and so I got the opportunity in 1983 to go to the Philippines and play basketball, represent the United States and the Lord. And my coach, a guy named Sheldon Bassett, he was just a great and wonderful coach, and he knew how to get the best out of his players. And he had coached under the infamous but great coach, Bobby Knight. And Bobby Knight, of course, is, for those of you that know anything about basketball, he is a legendary basketball coach who led the Indiana Hoosiers to several NCAA tournaments and wins. And at the same time, which some of you might not have known, he boasted the highest graduation rate for his players. So that was important to him. And he was also famous for throwing chairs and chewing out officials and players and fans and pretty much anybody that was in the vicinity when he got into those moves. Most of us didn't like his behavior, but he will go down and has gone down as one of the greatest coaches to coach the game. And he wrote a book entitled The Power of Negative Thinking. Interesting title, and according to Bobby Knight, hope is the worst word in the English language. He says it's foolish and lazy to tell yourself that things are going to be all right. And you might disagree with him on that, I do. But he said they'll only be right if somebody steps up and does something. Regardless of whether you like Bobby Knight or not, I'd say he's onto something. Hope needs a reason. Something or somebody that can change the trajectory, that can get us to a better place. Without a reason, hope is just wishful thinking. All of which to say, Mary had no reason to hope that morning. There was no wishful thinking, no naive optimism. She expected nothing more than a corpse badly in need of spices. And remember, she's already visited the tomb the first time with the two other women, heard these two angelic beings who I'm sure she didn't even realize were angels at that point. And they said that he had risen. And Mary had heard that. He is risen. But at that moment, as she stood in front of that tomb that second time, she wasn't buying it. She watched him die. She saw him laid to rest. As far as she was concerned, it's over. The empty tomb did not speak to her about a resurrection, not by a long shot. So she did what a lot of people do at a fresh grave. She cried. Because there was nothing else left for her to do. Sharing hope. Mary had no reason to hope that morning until she sensed someone standing there. And she turned to see who it was, and that someone asked her a question. And let's pick up the reading at verse 14. It says this: "At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. And he asked her, 'Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for?' And thinking he was the gardener, she said, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him.'" There's no concept of a resurrection here. And she didn't recognize who it was. Maybe it was the tears that were filling her eyes. She was overwhelmed with emotion and sorrow. Maybe it was dawn. It was a dim morning light. I don't know, but she didn't in the beginning recognize it. Maybe it was the fact that Jesus had changed a little bit. Maybe his appearance had changed with his resurrection body. But either way, Jesus, and I'm sure, kindly said, "Woman, why are you crying?" And there it is again, that question. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised that Jesus' first words after his resurrection were in the form of a question. Because if you read the Gospels and you see him meet people where they are, usually, always, it's followed with a question. That's important, because a lot of times he asks us a question. And now get this second part. He asks a question and he listens and he understands and he gives them time to answer. And here he does the same thing, and he teaches us to have compassion on other people. Jesus has always been full of compassion. We see that throughout all of his ministry, throughout all the Gospels. We saw him demonstrating love and compassion. And compassion, like hope, isn't just a feeling. It gets people out of themselves. It changes a person. It's an action word. It's the reason he fed the 4,000 and did all the miracles. It's why he waited for her that second time at the tomb, and why he addressed Mary alone at the grave that morning. And it turns out we don't share hope by hitting people over the head with it. Notice that Jesus doesn't say, "Ta-da! It's me, Jesus! Mary! It's me!" He doesn't say, "Stop crying, Mary, it's all good." And he certainly doesn't scold her for her lack of faith. He meets her where she is. He asks her to tell him about it, and he listens as she explains once again. Stop and think. He asks her a question, and then he waits and sits there while she explains her answer. Have you ever noticed how grieving people need to tell you what happened again and again and again? Mary does the same thing. In fact, let's give Mary credit for staying in the moment. Notice the two other disciples. I hate to say it, but they kind of did the typical guy thing. They race each other to the tomb. They barge in, they find it empty. Clothes are just lying there. Nothing's to be done here, Peter says. Yep, John says, let's go have some breakfast. And they run back and they leave Mary there all alone. And Mary stays in that moment, and that's when Jesus meets her there. And there's a lesson for those of us that want to share hope with other people. Don't rush in with good news. When someone's hurt and discouraged or grieving, they don't need happy talk. And they certainly don't need religious cliches. Oh, everything happens for a reason. Well, they're in a better place now. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I mean, are they true? Yeah. But don't say it. Grief is real. Loss is painful. Unemployment stinks. Relationships can break your heart. And we need to say so. And we need other people to feel it and be able to say so too. If someone in your world is hurting, if you want to share hope with them, the best thing to do is meet them in that moment. Ask them to tell you about it, and then sit long enough to listen. Don't lock your gun with answers to their dilemma. Just listen like Jesus did that morning. That's what Jesus did for Mary, and the truth is that's what he wants us to do with each other. If we let him. He wants to do that with us. Do you realize that? He wants to do that with us. He wants us to sit there and tell him why we're hurting, why we don't feel like we have hope, why this relationship is breaking our hearts. He knows the hurt. He knows the frustration. He wants us to tell him. And he's sitting there, and he's waiting. And he'll let us talk. That's the kind of God he is. And the question mark is, will we let him? Will we open our mouths? Will we share our hearts with him? Because he's obviously shared his heart with us. Hope comes from evidence and experience. So Jesus does this for Mary. He understood her humanness, her need, and then with compassion, when she was ready, he gently and very personally reveals himself to her. Verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned to him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. And Jesus said, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary. Mary. I wonder how he said it. Mary. There must have been something in the sound of his voice. Something at the mention of her name that made Mary stop. And I'm sure her heart didn't know what to do at that moment. It's him. She said Rabboni, which is an affectionate and respectful term. And suddenly she had a reason to believe again. Can you imagine that? She had no hope, and suddenly the hope goes through the roof. And notice it wasn't enough for Mary simply to confront the evidence of the resurrection, the empty tomb, the angel's announcement. That wasn't enough for her. That wasn't enough to convince her. She needed something more personal than that. A real and personal encounter with Jesus Christ, her Lord. And you know what? God knows that about us too. And what he did with her, he desires to do with us. He knows what we need. He knows the encounter that we need. But the question is, again, will we, as Mary did, stay long enough to let him get it? And sometimes we need that same thing, especially those of us who struggle in believing in Jesus. And some of us, we might be sitting here, and we struggle in believing that Jesus was who he said he was. We need evidence. And to be honest, let's be honest here. Actually, there is plenty of evidence that clarifies that. We have an empty tomb. We have written records, both historical in nature and biblical in nature. We have the transformation of the disciples. Now, let's be honest. 12 disciples, 11 of them went to their deaths voluntarily, and it was not easy deaths according to tradition. One was filleted, one was put between 4 horses, and his arms and legs were pulled off. Several of them were crucified. It's brutal. Why? Because they were claiming Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, will all of these men go to their deaths willingly unalive? Really? Except John. He was boiled in oil and then exiled to an island called Patmos. So he got off easy, I guess. But, see, the resurrection didn't occur. How many people died as Nero brought them into the Colosseum and live lions ripped them apart because they were Christians? But resurrection didn't really happen, you see. What would cause people to do that? Because they knew it was the truth. And we can go back in historical records. I don't know how many atheists have come to the place and say, I'm really going to study and find out. My mind, Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, both of them came to a point of having, after not believing that God was God, that Jesus was God, they both, in their attempt to discredit Christianity, became Christians. And it was the evidence, the intellectual evidence that caused them. And think about it, the emergence of this new faith that changed the face of the world, all these people willingly go to their deaths. A great divide in human history, BC and AD, the changes of lives of the people that we know. Brian. There's more than enough physical, logical evidence, but we also need something personal, something experiential, something relational. And that's what Jesus offered Mary there at that tomb. And he offers us. And suddenly he was there, more real, more powerful, more glorious than she ever had known him to be. And because of that, she had hope. And Jesus was not only there with her, he had proven that he was stronger than death, that he was stronger than evil, that he was stronger than all the bad things that can happen in the world. And at that point, I'm guessing that she just threw her arms around Jesus because they'd taken hold of his feet or something, because Jesus says in the original language, Mary stopped clinging to him. And he's telling her that he's not going to be with her in the same way like he was before, that he was going to the Father, but he was going to send the Spirit to be with them. And he'd already told them this, but now he's just clarifying it. And he says, but I'm going to be with you always, because the Holy Spirit is me. And I'm going to live in you now, not just around you. But then he says, go and tell. Her work isn't done now. He says, Mary, I'm giving you a message to share. It's more life-changing, more earth-shaking than you can even imagine. Go and tell the other disciples. Go and tell Mary. Tell my brothers, tell the world, I have risen. I defeated death. And anyone who comes to me and believes in me and has a personal relationship with me will live with me forever. And that's what she did. In verse 18, it says, Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. He told them, and she told them And he had said all of these things to me. Hope is a who. You see, hope is not a what, it's not a when, it's not a why. Hope is a who. Bobby Knight was right. Things get better. Things don't get better just because we want them to. They get better because someone does something. Hope is always embodied in a person. Shareholders hope the new CEO can turn the company around. Citizens hope a new leader can get their country back on track. Sports teams hope a new coach can lift their team out of the doldrums. Hope is a who. Somebody wise enough, strong enough, good enough to get us to a better place. And Jesus Christ is saying, I am that someone. It's interesting, somebody, I believe it was Keith Green, they interviewed him and he was talking about Jesus Christ and he said, I was studying all the different religions. And it's interesting, all these different religions, Hinduism and Buddhism and all these mystical religions, he said, they all say Jesus Christ was a good guy, he was a prophet. And then he went to Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ said, I'm God. And so he said, he goes, when I survey all these different guys, they're all pointing to Jesus Christ and saying he's the real deal. And Jesus, when I went to him, he said, I am the real deal. So he said, so I figured if I go with him, I got it all. That was my best bet. I can't lose if I go with Jesus. And some of you know his life turned around and he made a huge impact on the Christian world as a result. Jesus Christ is as somebody. His resurrection points that he's stronger than any setback, any failure, any loss, any disappointment, any demon that could come back in the middle of the night. And if life has a way of killing dreams, and it does, Jesus has a way of bringing them back to life. And that's not to say that we always get what we want, or that every bad thing can magically be undone. Life doesn't work that way. We all know that. But it does say that God can and will do something good with our future. And he even has a way of turning those bad things into good things. How he does that, I don't know. But he does that consistently. Brian is the example. Brian had a horrendous life. God got a hold of him. Now he's turning that around. And the bad things that happened have now become a platform for him to talk about Jesus. Only God can do that. Only Jesus can do that if we're willing to give him our hearts and our lives. If we are willing. Friends, it is not religion. Get that out of your mind. It's a personal relationship with a living God who knows you inside and out, knows all the negative, the bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and he still loves you in spite of it all. And he says, all I want is a relationship with him. You shared this morning, that we love him, we give him our hearts, and we let him do the cleanup. Do you have to change to come to know Christ? No. He'll do that. He just wants you. He just wants your heart. Notice Mary didn't get exactly what she wanted. Jesus wasn't going to be with her in the same way, but he was going to be with her in ways that she never dreamed possible. There was still a lot she didn't understand. And she didn't know exactly where her future held, but she knew that Jesus was alive, that he had risen, that things were going to be okay. And that's what hope is. Hope is the confidence that God can and will do something good in this life and life to come. I don't know how many of you have sat at the bedside of people that were near death. It's not fun. And I had had the opportunity, and I guess I would say privilege, of being next to some people that were in that ballpark. And what a drastic difference between those that knew Jesus and those that didn't know Jesus. The ones that knew Jesus, there was a hope that was inside of them. There was, I will even say, an illumination upon their being. And they talked. I can think of one woman who Now she forgot her English, and all she could do is talk in Italian. And in Italian, she was praising God. And she was praying for her children that were around her. And then I sat next to a man that for some reason he couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that Jesus loved him. And he was so afraid. And there was nothing I could do but just keep telling him about Jesus. And he grabbed me. He grabbed my arm and he said, Dave, I'm so afraid. I didn't know what to say. Whatever circumstances you might find yourself this morning, whatever pain, whatever loss, whatever disappointment you might be dealing with, God can do something good in it and over it. And that doesn't minimize the pain and the loss and the evil of it all. It simply means that the story isn't over yet. God can and meet us in that place, in that moment, as surely as he met Mary in that dark place. And he is strong enough, wise enough, and compassionate enough to do something good, even make good out of the bad, something meaningful, something significant, something like what he did for Mary. But he will wait for you to come to him. He's waiting for you to just not believe, but ask him for a relationship. And you have a choice. You can walk away from him, or you can walk toward him. But he's going to let you decide, because he won't turn on you. He won't walk away. And he will stand there and wait. In this life, we can find joy, beauty, forgiveness, healing, purpose, restoration, and the other realities of Christ's presence with us in everyday life. In the life to come, we can look forward to a reunion that those people have died and gone on before us that knew Christ, a restoration of creation. We don't have to worry about toxic atmosphere anymore. Eternal life with God, where there is a place where there is no sin. Can you imagine that? Not even temptation. It's gone. I love the thought. A lion laying down with a lamb. I'm cool with that. I'm getting right in the middle of it. Hope isn't wishful thinking. It's confident living. It's facing the future, knowing that God can and will do something good in this life and in the life to come. And because he lives, we can, and he waits for us to have this ongoing, immensely satisfying personal relationship with him. He didn't have to die on the cross and raise on the third day, but he did that because of his compassion. And he will meet us wherever we are. He will meet us personally, and like Mary, he is going to go further with us than anyone else dreamed. And he wants to have this personal relationship with us, to listen to us, to talk to us, to help us, to let us experience this hope that he can bring. And he wants that for us. Understand, he is not going to force you into a relationship with him. If you find yourself in a tough place now, you want to have the courage and honesty to stay in that place and invite Christ to meet you there. You don't have to measure up. You just have to invite him in. And maybe you know somebody that's in a place like that right now, somebody who's dealing with pain, disappointment, or loss, and share with them the hope that you have. Ask them how they're doing. Listen to them. Be with them. Pray with them. And when the right time comes, talk to them about Jesus. Because life has a way of killing our dreams. And Jesus has a way of bringing them back to life. And that's what Easter is all about. And that's why we celebrate communion this morning, remembering what he has done and what he will do. So as our man distributes the elements, let's wait.